Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our new Wind Down box, a quarterly sleep subscription box full of products I've handpicked to bring a little more joy and ease to your bedtime. If you are new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found us. I write conflict-free, family-friendly fiction that is designed to help you feel good and relax. All the stories take place in the same universe in what I call the Village of Nothing Much. I started telling these stories over 6 years ago in my bedtime story podcast, Nothing Much Happens. And so many listeners told me that sometimes they wish they could actually hear the story, but that it worked so well they fell asleep within minutes, sometimes within seconds, of hearing my voice. So we thought we'd expand a bit, and here we are. We've added in a lovely soundscape, and I've walked back my sleep voice so that hopefully I won't put you to sleep. I'll tell you 3 stories today, and if you stick around after, I'll share a few behind-the-scenes tidbits. Now, just because it's pretty much never a bad idea, let's take a deep breath in and sigh from the mouth. One more, like you mean it. In and out. Good. Our stories today get you out of the house in the warm summer weather. We'll start with Back to the Bakery, where we'll tip fresh bagels from their trays as they come out of the oven and box up a treat for someone special. Then we'll fill up our water bottle and head to the shore for Beach Walk, where sandpipers race the waves and big thoughts can help us find our place. Finally, we'll end the day at the summer fair, where kids race by with snow cones and booths full of handmade pieces wait to be discovered. Back to the bakery. In the kitchen, behind the wall of bread baskets, where we slot fresh baguettes and ciabattas and pyramids of rolls into place each morning, there is a long, flowery bench and a row of deep ovens that start heating before the village is awake. There's a long row of aprons on hooks, open shelves with dozens of mixing bowls, tall pitchers full of every kind and shape of spatula and mixing spoon and dusting wand, and a broad, cool slab of marble to roll pastries on. Over the years, I've learned how to time the proving and chilling so that a lot of prep happens in the afternoons and less while I'm still rubbing the sleep from my eyes at the crack of dawn. Still, I am an early riser, either by nature, perhaps I was a baker down deep in my genes, or at this point purely from habit, and never mind unlocking the door while the rest of the village slept. Today had been no different. A cool, quiet morning as I'd walked through the back alley just before dawn. I recognized the kitty with a crooked tail who was often stretched out in the front window of the tea shop, sitting now on a crate behind the bookstore. I think he got his breakfast there most days, and though I called out in a low voice to him, he didn't stop his morning ablutions so much as to look at me. I laughed, thinking of that old Nan Porter line that if cats could talk, they wouldn't. I found my key on the ring and jiggled it into the old lock until it turned, and I stepped into the kitchen. I had a routine. Coffee first. Luckily, the me from the day before had been looking out for the me of this morning, so the drip machine was ready. fresh grounds in the basket, and the reservoir filled with water, waiting to become something even more vital. I pushed the button and tied on my apron, and went hunting for my favorite cup while it brewed companionably on the counter. When my cup was full, I pulled up a stool by the register with a pad of paper and a sturdy black marker to make my morning punch list. It was a Friday. I was nearly sure, and I pulled my calendar closer to confirm. Yes, Friday. We'd need plenty of bagels and muffins for the breakfast crowd as they bustled in before work. And I had trays of bagels in the fridge formed and risen, ready to be pulled out. And when they'd reached room temperature, briefly poached before being slid into the oven. I'd made some with sesame seeds, some with a crust of crunchy salt, and some with swirls of cinnamon and raisins baked inside. The muffins I could mix with my eyes closed. The fresh strawberries had run out the week before, but now we had blueberries from a farm outside of town, and I thought they'd go perfectly with the candied yuzu zest and ginger syrup I had in the pantry. I always made a tray of lemon poppy seed, they were classics, and go-tos for lots of morning regulars. In a few more weeks, the cases of zucchini would start showing up, and I'd be making loaves and muffin tins full of the sweet, dense bread they lent themselves to so well. I'd check my shelves for the dark chocolate chunks I like to fold in with the grated zucchini. Along with the fruit itself would come a few precious boxes of the flowers, which we would dip in batter and fry off, wrapping them in wax paper and handing them out for afternoon snacks. I'd gotten distracted thinking about zucchini. I tapped my marker on the pad. What comes after muffins? Bread. Always bread. Sourdough and pumpernickel and soft, sweet wheat. Baguettes and ciabatta that made good toasted sandwiches, and the rolls people bought to go with their salads at lunch. And a good lot of pastries as well, some filled with jam and others with warm chocolate. When I'd taken over this place from the previous owner, a man whose baking had inspired me for years, he'd encouraged me to push our customers toward new flavors and textures. He told me that when he started, no one wanted anything other than white bread, birthday cakes, and a chess pie on Sundays. It took time, he said, but soon his rye and pumpernickels were bestsellers. His pretzels and sesame cookies became parts of traditions for a lot of people in the village. No one even contemplated getting through New Year's without a box of his flaky cardamom buns. It had been the same for me and the pastries. No one bought any for the first month. They didn't know how to eat them, when and with what. But slowly I found myself wrapping more and more in bakery paper and handing them across the counter to watch the customers take immediate bites, not wanting to waste a moment of their still warm, flaky deliciousness. And nowadays they were always sold out by 10 a.m. I just started to sneak pistachio into the mix. We'd see how that went. I stood up and refilled my coffee and went into the kitchen. I washed my hands and started pulling trays out of the fridge and heating the ovens. There was an ancient radio, old enough to have a tape deck in it, but still working, propped up on a shelf over the sink, and I reached up on tiptoes to twist the knob. When I was younger, this station had played the newest music that came out on the tapes that would probably still work in the deck, the kind that every now and then had to be rewound in their cases with a carefully angled pencil. But as the years went by, the playlists had stayed the same, and now I guessed these were oldies. I didn't mind. I liked knowing the words, the drum beats, and the spots where the bridge flowed into the chorus. Soon the bagels were coming out, the muffins and bread loaves going in. I was a few minutes away from flipping the sign on the front door, and my morning helpers would be here in a minute, tying on their aprons and pouring their own cups of coffee to keep close to their stations. Each morning we filled a few orders for local cafes and diners, and I set about laying out their trays. I had scraps of paper tacked up on the board above my station, with each spot's order, though they rarely changed, and I knew them by heart. As I set out the sliced sandwich bread and bagels, my first assistant of the morning appeared behind me with a tray of hot donuts. Time always got away from me in the morning. I blessed my staff for paying attention to the clock and added the donuts to the tray. I was about to wrap the last order, the one for the diner kitty corner from our front door, when I remembered something special I'd made the night before. I often slipped a little treat into this order. The waitress who came to fetch it each morning was a friend, and the best test taster we had. It had been a week of hot, sunny days, and I'd had tiramisu on my mind. Served chilled with plenty of espresso-soaked ladyfingers and a dusting of cocoa powder on top, it was the perfect summer boost. In fact, its name meant pick-me-up. I took a tray of it from the freezer and used my sharp chef's knife to cut out a perfect square. It was frozen hard, so the layers showed perfectly along the sides, and I knew a moment of baker's pride as I slid the square into a paper container, which I folded closed, took out a marker to write across the top. Let sit for 10 minutes, then have the perfect summer breakfast. A dash and a scribbled heart, and I popped it onto the tray with the rest. I heard the bell over the door ring. Another day at the bakery had begun. Beach walk. Sometimes I went in the afternoon, or just before sunset. It depended on the day, on the heat, and the sun, and how many other people might be walking. Today I woke up early and decided that before I got tangled up in any other ideas, in chores, or a to-do list, I'd just go. It was something a friend of mine used to say, when in doubt, do what you were going to do first. A suggestion to trust your instincts and not overthink. So I trusted mine. I put my swimsuit on with shorts and a tank top and grabbed a few beach towels and the jug I took on hikes filled with ice water and drove out to the beach. The lot was a long, narrow space that would be full of cars and scooters and bikes by midday, but this early there were only a few others parked there. I left most of my things in the car thinking I'd take a long walk, then come back here before a swim. I even left my flip-flops in the footwell of the car. As soon as I stepped out onto the sand, I wanted to be barefoot. It was cool under my soles and damp, just the right texture to make a castle with. The sun was still low on the horizon. Its rays hadn't had a chance yet to heat up all those many grains of sand. I stood still, feeling it shift beneath me, wondering how many there might be on a beach like this. I'd read once that our brains run on 86 billion neurons, that there are 200 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. And I wondered about the number of blades of grass, of feathers, of pounds of salt in the ocean, of gemstones buried deep inside the ground. If I take 20,000 breaths a day, and so do you and everyone else, could we add them all up and divide by grains of sand? I smiled at myself as I started to walk, imagining some sort of cosmic accounting. An abacus made of stars, multiplying my breaths with the wing beats of bees. Being ankle-deep in sand and so near the sound of the waves did this to me, made me feel very small, but absolutely in balance with the bigger universe. I felt like finding the red dot on the map. You are here. And here I was, striding slowly down the beach, closer to the water. If you've ever brought little ones to the beach or a swimming pool or even near to a sprinkler, you can see it in their faces. They are irresistibly drawn to it. And even in my grown-up body, I felt the same way. I couldn't wait to feel the water wash over my ankles. And I picked up my pace and splashed in. The cool waves rolling over my feet felt like relief. Like those videos of folks working to help a sea turtle who's been flipped on its back. They get him right side up again, and you watch him push and paddle closer to the water until he slips all the way in and it washes over his shell. And you think, what a relief it must have been. How good it must have felt to be home. I started to walk through the shallows, sometimes stepping onto the just damp sand and sometimes getting wet up to my knees. I watched a time step of long-legged sandpipers racing along the water, chasing each wave back as it rolled out and running from the next rolling in. They had tall, jointed legs and long, pointed bills for digging in the sand, and I used to mistake them for piping plovers, alliterative birds. They were plumper and paler and short-billed, and a rare sight on this beach. There were only a few people walking, and almost no one set up in the sand yet. I enjoyed the solitude and stopped frequently to turn over stones and shells with my toes. I carried some into the water and rinsed the sand from them in my hands, noticing the iridescent insides of the shells and the tiny specks of color in the rocks. I found a few very good skipping stones, broad and smooth and flat. And while most of them went straight in with a plop, the last one skipped across the surface 4 times before sinking in. How many times had that same stone been cast out and washed back up to be scooped out of the surf and skipped again? Maybe the one I threw had been last skipped by someone 100 years ago, who also liked to get up early and walk before the sand got hot. And maybe they had wondered about the hands that threw it another 100 years before. Ahead of me, a black dog with shining wet fur sat at its owner's feet, its tail thumping into the sand excitedly, begging for a stick to be thrown back into the water. The owner lifted it high, in an arch overhead, like they were casting a fishing line, and threw it far out into the waves. The dog darted, keen on its mission, and swam for what I guessed was the 20th time this morning to retrieve it. I watched as the dog caught up the stick and turned in the water, dog paddling to the shore. His muzzle was stark white against his black fur, and the sight of his sweet, older face made me put my hand on my heart. A sudden clench of emotion. He wouldn't always be able to do this, but today he could, and this person was here for it. I started to notice a few umbrellas propped in the sand, folding chairs being wrestled into place, towels unfurled like tablecloths. The sun was rising higher and the humid air was heating up. I was ready for my swim, so I turned and began walking back in the direction I had come. I passed a giant piece of driftwood. It was bleached white from the sun, gnarled and dry, but still recognizably a part of a tree. Maybe it had been struck by lightning, or just snapped by strong winds and sent into the water. It had washed up here, who knows how many years ago now, and was a sort of local landmark. I'd seen high school students posing for pictures in front of it, and it was depicted in a watercolor in a gallery up the street. Sometimes people left shells balanced on it, and once I'd seen a team of folks building a huge sandcastle, incorporating it into the moat. I started the climb up toward my car, already thinking of the jug of cold water and spreading my towel out in the sand. It was just a simple beach walk, but how many places I'd already been this morning. at the summer fair. As kids, we always went during the day, riding the rides and playing the games, eating pretzels with lines of yellow mustard squeezed on top and blue snow cones that stained our lips. We didn't mind the heat and ran from one booth to another, calling out to each other about where to go next. At some point, we'd be rounded up and taken home, dusty and exhausted, and still chattering about all the things we'd seen and done. Now, as grown-ups, we like to go in the late afternoon, as the sun was sinking behind the trees, the hottest part of the day behind us, and the breeze of evening starting to break through the midsummer air. We'd set out from home hand in hand, and made our way toward the sound of the fair in the distance. In my memory, the fairgrounds were huge, paths you could get lost in, and always a corner of the park that you hadn't explored. But now I saw that it had only ever been the green space of the city park, and the gravel lot beside it, with a row of artist booths stretching down along the riverfront. All along the edges of the fair were tall wooden bins filled by a local orchard with the ripe stone fruits of the season. Peaches and plums and nectarines and tiny yellow-orange apricots were heaped in sweet-smelling mounds. The fruit was so abundant at this point in the summer, and the orchard so generous that you could just help yourself to anything that sounded good. Plums were my favorite, but if they aren't perfectly ripe, they can be terribly sour and hard to get your teeth through. We stopped to survey the offerings, and I found a couple small but soft and ripe-smelling plums. They had that frosted shimmer on their skins with deep purple underneath. I slipped them into my pocket to eat later, maybe after a short stay in the fridge. It made me think suddenly of that brief and lovely poem by William Carlos Williams that goes, "This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet, and so cold." We linked hands again and stepped into the heart of the fair. Kids ran and chased. Bunches of friends strolled on the midway. A teddy bear clamped under an arm, one at a booth somewhere along the way. The people watching was excellent. Here was an older couple, watching from a bench, canes propped beside and a huge bag of popcorn between them, their hands bumping together as they reached in for another mouthful. Here was a grunt of teens, and that is the collective noun for teenagers. A grunt, or alternatively, an attitude of teens. Boastful and merrily loud after a couple months of running free from school, holding court by the Ferris wheel. Here were 4 women who looked so much alike they must be sisters, each with long dark hair and bright shades of lipstick, having a good gossip while an occasional kid would run up to ask for $1 or hand over a cast-off sweater. Lucky children, I thought. When you can turn as easily to an aunt as to your mom to have your shoelace tied, they won't know till they're older how sweet that is. We'd ridden the Ferris wheel lots back when we were teenagers ourselves, and we didn't need any teddy bears, and we weren't yet ready to sit on a bench and eat popcorn. So we walked past all of that and down to the booths of art and handmade things by the river. We went slowly, looking at silver rings set with polished stone, watercolors of some local landmarks, soaps and salves. I bought something good for mosquito bites, tiny hand-bound books you could write stories in, and rows of ceramics. I'm a sucker for teacups and coffee mugs. However many I've got, I'd always like one more. And as I was looking, I got a little squeeze from the hand I was holding, which I knew meant, go on, pick out a good one. I found a squat little cup, the glaze smooth bluish green, with a broad spot at the top of the handle to rest your thumb. I pointed to it. It was paid for, and wrapped up in yesterday's newspaper, tucked into my bag for tomorrow morning's tea. I'll have it with my plums, I thought. The sunlight was going, and the tall street lamps were coming on around us. We could turn home, and soon we would, but maybe we'd just walk a little bit further, down along the river first. After all, in the course of a year, these summer nights were few and should be savored. Let's walk a little further. Now, before I send you off home, I thought I'd share a few thoughts and behind-the-scenes tidbits about these stories. The Back to the Bakery story, of course, features the baker, who is one of the most popular characters in my stories. I think lots of us harbor some romantic ideas about what it might be like to trade in a hectic job for the cozy, sugar-dusted life of a small-town baker. There are lots of elements of her life I could tell you about, as she has appeared in many stories by now. But what I most thought about as I was reading back through this one is the pause she took as she wrapped up that piece of tiramisu for the waitress at the diner. The waitress also appears in the first bakery story. You can hear it in episode 17 of this show if you'd like to. And I think since that first ep, their friendship has grown. I think the baker is showing us something a little vulnerable as she draws a heart on that takeout container with the delicious treat in it. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. In Beach Walk, we hear another recurring motif in my stories, and that is my love of collective nouns. The particular name we give to a group of something, like a bevy of swans or a promise of tomorrows, an unkindness of ravens, or, as in this story, a time step of sandpipers. I use collective nouns as much as I possibly can, and I encourage you to do it too, even if you have to make them up. I have now finished paying off my degree, Spanish major, linguistics minor, but I still feel like I need to get a bit more bang out of those bucks, so let me tell you that a lovely thing about language is that it is meant to evolve and change and grow. So make up some collective nouns this week. Finally, we ended at the summer fair. Another collective noun alert. And if you enjoyed hearing about the four sisters, the couple sitting on the bench, and so on, this story got a full-page, beautiful illustration by Léa Lepivert in my book, Nothing Much Happens. And there is also a full page of the bakery in the book. So ask your librarian or local bookseller for a copy. Thank you for visiting with me here in the village of Nothing Much. May you spot a troubling of goldfish in a pond. May you happen upon a constellation of wishes and ease your hunger with a whisk of muffins. We'll be back soon with more stories from the village of Nothing Much.